So for me, October starts on September 1st. And it's not that I don't like summer or anything like that, it's just that as a very pale, very flammable ginger, I'm not a huge fan of summertime weather, and honestly I just don't think that hoodie season lasts long enough in Ohio as it is, and with that also comes a bunch of spooky stuff for Halloween, which is basically my favorite time of the year. So because I like to start decorating for Halloween in early to mid-September, I figured, you know what, why not go ahead and extend that philosophy to the channel as well, and go ahead and get a jump on some spooky content. So today's video is actually all about some games that I'm just personally excited to play on the Steam Deck as Halloween gets closer and closer this year. So that's what today's video is all about. I just want to have some fun and showcase a few games that I'm really pumped to dive into this October, and I'm going to go ahead and start this list off with a game that is not technically a full-blown game, but it is a DLC, or I guess an expanded scenario from one of my favorite horror games of all time that's been that way for about 20 years, I would say, which is kind of terrifying in itself to say out loud, and that is Silent Hill 2's Born from a Wish scenario. Now, ever since I first played it back in 2001, Silent Hill 2 has remained on the short list of not just my favorite horror games, but honestly just my favorite games, period. Mostly because it tackled some very adult themes, and I just never really seen that so richly realized in a video game before, and I was completely infatuated by it. It functions almost as a standalone side story in the original Silent Hill canon, by which I mean you don't have to have played the other games to have a good time with Silent Hill 2, provided you don't mind some clunky combat controls, but considering it's a game that's mostly about surviving Silent Hill and finding your wife rather than just killing everything in sight, I wouldn't let clunky combat be a sticking point or anything. The story really is the star here, and it comes to life thanks to some incredibly interesting secondary characters like Angela, Eddie, and Maria, who looks suspiciously like your deceased wife. But I'm not playing the base game of Silent Hill 2 this year, rather what I wanted to do was finally finish the Born from a Wish scenario, which stars Maria, and it actually takes place shortly before Maria meets up with James in the main events of Silent Hill 2. Now, this wasn't included in the original PS2 release, but rather was made available on the Xbox version of the game, and then later was added to the PS2 Greatest Hits release of Silent Hill 2. Now, I won't be playing the PC release of Silent Hill 2 on the Steam Deck, and come to think of it, I'm not even sure if the Born from a Wish scenario was in that release, so I'll be emulating it using the PS2. Now, I did talk about this game previously in a video that I did about emulating PS2 games on the Steam Deck. Unfortunately, when I was filming that, there were some weird lines in the screen for Silent Hill 2 specifically, and I could not figure out how to get rid of them. However, huge thanks to Stefan Carnignani, which I hope I'm pronouncing that right, I'm really sorry if I'm not Stefan, but he actually clued me in on how to get rid of these lines, and it worked like a champ. Apparently within the PCSX2 emulator, there's a place where you can actually enable auto hacks, and for whatever reason I had it disabled, but as soon as I put this in place, the lines disappeared, and now it looks way better on the deck. Not that it looked terrible before, honestly I think I probably could have lived with it, but still, if you can make it look even closer to the original release, why wouldn't you? So yeah, long story short, I think that Silent Hill 2 actually looks much better on the deck now that I've done this. Thank you again for that tip, Stefan. And if you've never played Silent Hill 2 before, there's no better time than now as we get close to the Halloween season. Plus, if you do play it on the deck and you're using it through an emulator, you can defang the difficulty just a little bit by using state saves. But speaking of horror DLC that I never got around to, next up on this list will be Alan Wake's American Nightmare. So rather than being included alongside the main game, American Nightmare is a sort of expand-alone experience that's kind of a spin-off from Alan Wake proper. Originally it was released on Xbox Live and PC way back in 2012, but sadly it did not get the remaster treatment like last year's remaster of the original Alan Wake. And I know next to nothing about Alan Wake's American Nightmare except for a couple of things. The first is that you do play as Alan Wake, and I believe it has something to do with Alan Wake's doppelganger, which I think is named Mr. Scratch. And then secondarily, I just remember that the game started off with Kasabian's Clubfoot, and it was an absolutely incredible opening. But beyond that, I know very little about Alan Wake's American Nightmare. The only thing that I'm relatively sure of is that it's going to include more of the combat that I really enjoyed in the first Alan Wake, which will have me stunning a lot of enemies with a flashlight and then finishing them off with various firearms. And that is enough for me. Now sadly, since I didn't get around to finishing the remaster last year when it was released, I will have to brush up a little bit on the events of Alan Wake for some context, but I'm definitely excited to see where the story goes here. Not just for the odd narrative and to spend more time getting familiar with Remedy's shared universe that ties into its more recent releases, but also because I just really enjoyed the gameplay in Alan Wake. Not to mention it's a fully verified title on the deck anyways. Next up, rather than an open or pseudo-open world horror experience, is a very confined experience, or at least that's what it looks like to me, and that is Toilet Chronicles. So Toilet Chronicles is a gift from my friend Morrow, and I don't think this is a particularly long experience, but the premise of this horror comedy game is that you're at a party in 2008 and you are in the bathroom, and I think the goal is to escape the bathroom. I think. I've only played it a little bit so far, but it seems really similar to another 2D survival game that I played on the deck recently called House, where you play as a young girl who keeps waking up and you keep trying to get out of your house, but every time you can die in a variety of just horrifying and creative ways. But Toilet Chronicles looks to have a more modern, probably more cosmic twist, I would say, because I sure have seen a tentacle or two in this game so far. And again, I'm expecting this will be kind of a short and sweet adventure, despite the fact that it's supposed to have multiple endings, and I really do have a lot of nostalgia for this style of game because the earliest survival horror game that I ever played, and I don't even know if you can classify it as that, but it was an old point-and-click adventure game from Sierra in the late 80s, I want to say, for DOS. I was like 5 or 6 years old, and that was a game called Lara, Bo, and the Colonel's Bequest. I used to play that game with my mom. It was my earliest exposure to any sort of horror game, and this game feels like that in so much as, you know, you can die in a variety of interesting ways, and you do have a mystery to unravel. So yeah, Morrow, thank you again for getting this for me, even though I'm sure it is super weird, and I'm hoping I'll have a good time with it. Next up is Pumpkin Jack, which I think I bought a couple of months ago at this point when it was on sale, but I refused to play it until we got closer to Halloween. But now that we are closer to Halloween, I went ahead and jumped in and played a little bit of it so far, and I think this one's going to be a really good time. The premise of Pumpkin Jack is that the devil has unleashed a curse of eternal darkness on the world, and the world has responded by summoning a champion wizard to help defend them. And in turn, the devil has his own champion, Pumpkin Jack, who I believe is also known as Stingy Jack, who I believe was a con man in life, but you've been summoned back, stuffed into a pumpkin, and now it's your job to go take down a wizard. It's an action platformer with some light puzzle solving, and I'm pretty sure anybody who looks at this would agree that it gives off some medieval vibes. Although personally I never really got into that game, and I was so excited about the remaster that came out on the PS4 a couple years ago, but unfortunately I felt like it held too tightly to the original design mechanics. Specifically, it did not have a very forgiving checkpoint system, so I didn't really get into it, but I think Pumpkin Jack is a game that I will very much get into. It's spooky and charming in the platforming, and more importantly, the checkpoints are a lot more forgiving in this than they were in Medieval, so I'm definitely looking forward to finishing this one in October and seeing what Pumpkin Jack's really all about, because personally, I suspect that we are an anti-hero of sorts, and I don't think he's going to remain a bad guy in the Devil's Champion. I think maybe in some like power of friendship or renewed faith in humanity, maybe Jack turns a corner and becomes like a hero, like a good guy by the end of it, or at least that's what I'm hoping. But, you know, again, I'll have to see because that's a game that I really want to play this year. And finally, speaking of tragic heroes, the last game that I want to spend some time with is Vampire. Or Vampire. Vampire. It's got a Y. Now, I actually already played Vampire a couple of years ago on the Nintendo Switch, and I would say I made it about maybe 5 or 10 hours in, but recently I found that it was on sale for the Steam Deck, so I went ahead and took the leap because I figured Vampire game, that's probably perfect for Halloween, but also because I really wanted to explore more of the story. Now, if you're not familiar, Vampire is set in 1918, and you will play as Dr. Jonathan Reed, a doctor who has recently returned from World War I back to the city of London. Now, I won't spoil it here, but suffice it to say his origin is a tragic one, and the story kicks off in a very dramatic way. And depending on your choices, that tragedy may extend well beyond Dr. Reed himself and actually affect the entire citizenry of London. And that's because, depending on the choices you make, you might leave the city in a very good place, or you might leave it in an absolutely horrifying place that is far worse than when you first arrived. And really, I'd say that's a credit to the developers here, who have done a great job at interlinking the narrative and the mechanics of the game. Because if you want, you can definitely just feed on as many citizens as possible, and that will in turn give you a much faster way to get all the vampiric abilities that are at your disposal. Or you might choose to not feed on people as much as you can, which will make you a weaker vampire, but it will make for a stronger London. Now, as I recall, like the actual action and fighting mechanics are fine. I don't think they're anything exceptional, but really the biggest draw from here was the narrative more than anything else. Plus, I think they took a really unique approach to their morality system. Rather than the way some games handle it, where you're just sort of cartoonishly over-the-top evil, twisting your mustache, or you're just a dyed-in-the-wool Boy Scout, it seems like Vampire takes a more nuanced approach and allows you the flexibility to kind of be a little bit of both, which I suspect is where I'm going to land. Most of the time when I play a game like this, I would try to be altruistic, but at the same time, considering the difficulty will literally get easier if you choose to become more powerful, and I'm kind of a filthy casual gamer when you get right down to it, there's a good chance that I'm going to eat at least a few people in this game. Now, like I said, I have played it a little bit on the Steam Deck so far, and I believe 50 frames per second was about the sweet spot for me, so that's where I capped the refresh rate and also the frame rate. But yeah, if you've never played Vampire before, it's actually really, really good, at least from what I've played of it so far, and I'm hoping I can actually wrap it up this October. Now, I'm sure beyond the games I've already listed here, there's going to be, of course, a few bonus games that I'm going to play some more of. Like Dying Light 2, I've barely had a chance to spend any time with, although I'll be playing that on the PS5 rather than the Steam Deck, I would say. And also, I'm definitely going to play more Cult of the Lamb, because that game is just incredibly good, and I try to get as many people addicted to it as I can. But hey, what about you? Are there any games that you've been waiting for Halloween to hit so you can actually dive in and explore them, just be kind of a seasonal gamer like I've mentioned in the past? Or are there any games that you would recommend people play this October, because I'm definitely on the lookout for new games to pick up over the next several weeks as I keep making videos about it. If so, let me know in the comments below. As always, thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to watch these videos. I really, really appreciate it. Take care, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.